Ladies and gentlemen, in order to keep our ball rolling, I suggest we now start our afternoon session. It's my pleasure to introduce our afternoon speaker, who is Philip Jenkins. Philip was educated at the University of Cambridge, unfortunately Clare College rather than another one, but nevertheless he has a Cambridge PhD. He moved to Pennsylvania State University at a fairly early stage in his career, where his early specialism was in criminal justice, and he served as Professor of Criminal Justice and American Studies. Became Distinguished Professor of History and Religious Studies, then Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of Humanities, which is his present position. In addition, he's Distinguished Senior Fellow of the Institute for the Studies of Religion here at Baylor. That, I think, already gives a little indication of the reality, which is that Philip has actually had a remarkably varied career. He has published very extensively in the field of criminal justice, but before that, he was a historian of his native Wales, and indeed did a very well-known history of Wales, which I have on my shelves, but I had no idea before yesterday that it was by the Philip Jenkins that we're now going to hear. I thought it was a different persona. He's gone through lots of phases, and this is a sign of the extraordinary versatility which is very evident in his published work. I will not attempt to go through the full list. That would defeat our object in hearing him this afternoon. Let me just draw attention to a crucial text which I'm sure many in this room will have read, The Next Christendom, The Rise of Global Christianity, which I think is one of the most important books in the history of Christianity published in the 21st century. It has already been republished in German, Chinese, Korean, Polish, Portuguese and Italian. So all those countries agree with me. This is an extraordinarily important text. More recently, he's published The Lost History of Christianity, the 1,000-year golden age of the Church in the Middle East, Africa and Asia, and how it died. A very important study of the earlier history of Christianity in lands where it ceased to be dominant, with interesting reflections on the implications of that phenomenon. His next book, and I do want to plug the next book because that's in a sense the most important for us, we all want to go away and buy it, is called Jesus Wars: How 4 Patriarchs, 3 Queens and 2 Emperors Decided What Christians Would Believe for the Next 1,500 Years. It's about 5th century Christology. What a brilliant titling that is. It's about the wars between the blues and the greens over the nature of Christ. And yet, the title and the subtitle express the reality of what he'll be telling us. He makes history accessible. That is one of his greatest gifts. Many of us have cause to be grateful to him for that. I'm sure we're now going to have cause to be grateful to him for what he's going to talk about this afternoon. His title is A Little Leaven, From Mass Church to Creative Minority in Contemporary Europe. Philip.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you all the organisers of this wonderful conference. I'm going to talk about contemporary Europe, and when you look at the topic of secularization, obviously Europe is the prime example. My quote, my title, of course, you may know the full part, which is, a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. And in the context of Europe, it certainly appears to be a lump, as in the phrase, it is an ex-continent, it has ceased to be. The idea is that Christianity, at least, is dead or dying in Europe. And what I want to talk about today is certainly organized institutional Christianity is in a very poor state. However, there are some interesting signs of growth and life which are very troubling for the stereotype. They shouldn't be there. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book about religion in Europe that was called God's Continent. And I can't begin to tell you the number of people who I would say, I'm writing a book about religion in Europe, and they would say, it must be a very short book. Actually, it wasn't. Actually, it was quite a long one, but just to start with a context which suggests why this is such an important topic. Whether you are a Christian believer or not, the fact of the survival of Christianity in Europe is an enormously important point for world politics, for world affairs, and the United States, because as everyone knows, Islam is growing in Europe. There's a phrase which you may have in mind. 20 years ago, is it really 20 years ago? Salman Rushdie published the Satanic Verses, calling forth fury among Muslims in Europe, many of whom carried placards saying, Islam, our religion today, your religion tomorrow. And in different forms, that idea of Islam being the future of Europe has infected many people. There are scholars who talk about Europe becoming part of Eurabia. Bernard Lewis, who should know better, has talked about by the end of the present century, Europe will merge into the broader Islamic world and become part of the Western Maghreb, alongside Morocco and Algeria. The reasons for this are very simple, and they actually are germane to the whole question of revival, so I just urge your patience 1 second. The basic reasons are demographic, and I'm going to come back to that a lot. I believe that whenever you look at the topics of secularization and revival, either or, demographics are crucial. Children are critical to this story, and I'll explain in a moment. In order for a society to maintain a stable population, you need a total fertility rate of about 2.1 children per woman. And most of Europe is far below that. In many areas, the figure might be 1.2, 1.3, and there is no way that you can keep up a society indefinitely with that sort of fertility rate. You need more and more people drawn from outside to do the jobs, to sell the burgers and to take care of the people in the old people's home who couldn't be bothered to have children. And where do those people come from? Well, the greatest single difference between the United States and Europe is where the people come from. In the United States, they tend overwhelmingly to be from Christian countries, and in Europe, they tend to be from Muslim countries. I once had somebody express it to me in the Netherlands, and again, someone who should have known better, saying, that is the difference. You have Mexicans, we have Moroccans. And in a sense, that is a part of the story. Immigration will happen. But what kind of Europe will those Muslims come into? And I'm certainly not one of those people who speaks of Muslims in the sense of, this terrible menace that will sweep the continent. As I'll suggest a little later, I think there is something to Eurabia as an idea, but what will happen is that much of the Arab world will become more European rather than the other way around. And once again, children and demography are part of the story. We'll come back to that. Will Muslims come into a religious wasteland, an empty territory of aging people who basically have let their religion die? Or will they come into an area where Christianity survives and thrives in different ways, and where that negotiation, those transactions, are a large part of the story? That makes for a very different kind of Europe. I'm going to suggest it's the latter. Now, I can point to many cases which suggest that Christianity especially, and religion generally are very sick indeed in Europe. I can cite any number of statistics about that. You can quibble with particular statistics, particular surveys, but on balance, the picture is overwhelming. If you look at the Netherlands, for example, the proportion of the population that adheres to one of the churches has basically halved in about 40 years. All across Europe, you see this common picture. A major change sets in the mid-60s, initially in the Protestant countries, later in the Catholic countries, and then whatever statistic you care to look at, over those 40 years, you see massive, steep declines in the proportion believing in a God, believing in a personal God, being members of a church, or attending a church, whatever criterion you want to look at. And alarmingly, that is not a one-off change that happened and then reversed. I recently saw a figure which pointed out that the number of Catholic seminarians in Europe had declined between 2001 and 2006. We're not talking ancient history here, folks, by 13.5%. You do not suffer losses like that in a 5 or 6 year period and survive. The organized institutional churches are suffering badly, and especially those communities that aim to be what I call the mass church. The national churches, the state churches in countries like England, like Denmark, countries that might not have had an official state role, but that nonetheless regarded themselves as the church of the national community. I think of the Roman Catholic Church in France, which of course had not had a role as an established church for 100 years, but still until very recently was de facto had that kind of role. France is no longer a Catholic country. Just in the last few years, the proportion of French people who regard themselves as Catholic is now below 50%. Very steep change in a short time. If you want to imagine an unusual geography, here is the geography of the world. Here we have Africa as the most notoriously religious continent, where the proportion of people who believe in God is around 90%. Here we have Europe, where the average is around 21%, and between the two, floating somewhere in the Mediterranean, is the United States, somewhere between the European and the African figure. This change is reflected in lots of different ways. In fact, one of the alarming things is what I call the rule of 10. If you look, for instance, at seminary populations as they were at the peak of the mass churches, of the state churches in the 1950s, and look at them today, take the numbers and divide by 10. Institutions, seminaries, which perhaps had 500 pupils in 1960, would today have 50. And that is true across the continent, including in countries like Ireland. The Archdiocese of Dublin, for example, with 1 million people, these days hopes to ordain 1 new priest a year. Once again, it can't go on. I want to look at the issue of why this has happened, because you have to understand the reasons why before you can look at any possibility of change or revival. I've mentioned this issue of demographics. Children are very closely bound up with the fate of a religion, especially if it is an established traditional religion. A huge amount of the activity of, for example, a state church consists of socializing and educating children, leading them through, for instance, confirmation classes. If you have a city in Italy where you have a parish here, and 40 years ago there were 100 children going through that process, and now there are 5, that means that you have a great many people in that community who might be married but do not have children. They don't have children to link them to the church. There is no longer any reason to bind them to the church. And there are more psychological reasons, perhaps. When you have children, you are more concerned about the future. There's a very good book about this by a European writer called The End of the Chain. If you don't have children, you are the end of the chain. Even, you begin asking yourself, posterity? What has posterity ever done for me? You focus on the here and now. You're not interested in that kind of long term. You have what you might call a feedback relationship. As people lose faith in religion, they lose the incentive that perhaps makes them want to have families and children. When they don't have children, they lose the religious tie even more. And that is a feedback loop, a vicious circle, whatever you want to call it, which may have no natural end. Once you've committed auto-genocide, what do you do after that? There are areas in northern Germany now which have got fertility rates of 0.8. I'm not aware of communities like that in history. It can't go on. I just make a digression here, and I won't go into this in great detail. There is a saying in Europe which is the closer a woman lives to Rome, the fewer children she has. The closer she lives to the Vatican, the fewer children she has. And that appears to work very well. It's a good empirical observation. The reason why you will not see Europe sliding into the Western Maghreb is that, these changes I'm talking about, fewer children, women wanting fulfillment in the workplace, defining themselves as more than mothers. The places where that is now happening most would include countries like Algeria, Morocco, Iran, and much of the Arab world. The Arab world, much of the Muslim world, is now going through this demographic transition. And what that should mean is that in 10 or 20 years, these countries are going to be older, stabler. I imagine a scene in Iran in a few years where an Ayatollah will urge, let us go forward on the path of jihad, and a bunch of 40-year-old guys will respond, no, we're too busy playing video games. And that is why Europe will not become Muslim, because Muslim population rates, fertility rates are falling so rapidly. Why? Because Muslims live in Europe. Europe, this great malarial swamp for religion. And the infection goes home. As Europe in 10, 20, 30 years needs to find people to do its jobs, it will have to delve ever deeper into Africa, and heaven forbid they'll have to draw in ever more Christians. So that is going to be a whole different side of the story. Anyway, I won't talk about that in detail, except to say that Iran is now heading very fast on the Spanish, the Italian road. Secularization has a huge amount to do with the atomization of society, the decline of large families, an ever greater role of women in the workplace. Obviously, the increasing separation of the idea of sexuality from reproduction, and a set of ideas that leave the traditional churches being represented as killjoys, as enemies of fulfillment, as enemies of women, as basically these very reactionary forces. Originally, this change affected the Protestant world. David Martin has a nice phrase about the secular belt that runs through Europe, and the points he puts on it are Birmingham in England, Amsterdam in the Netherlands, Copenhagen in Denmark, Stockholm in Sweden, Berlin, and then on to Tallinn in Estonia. Sociologists of religion love Estonia because it is the most radically secular country in Europe, together with the Czech Republic, and so it's a great case study. Denmark, however, is kind of an interesting one. It is a classic example of a state church, and as the phrase goes, everyone loves the state church and nobody goes to it. In other words, they are members of it. But it takes me on to my next topic. No one can deny that Europe has secularized dramatically in the last 40 years, that the state churches, that the mass churches have declined very significantly. Just to take, one city, if you look at Magdeburg in Germany, maybe 8% of the population will define themselves as Christian. In what sense can you call a city like that a Christian community? But I want to suggest a couple of things, and this is one of the topics, as I've listened to papers here in the last day or so, that maybe we don't talk about enough when we look at revival and revivalism. And that is the concept of memory. Before a revival can happen, there has to be an audience. I'm not so much interested in the leaders because, as I'm sure you know, leadership, what's that old phrase? Leadership is a function of followership. You need an audience. You need a community that can move forward into revival. You have to know who those people are in terms of their social background, their interests, and so on. But you also have to know what they remember. What kind of ideas are in their minds? What kind of images are in their minds? If you like, embers waiting to be brought back into some kind of flame. Now I realize you may be sitting there thinking, embers bursting into flame in Europe. Surely this is a science fiction concept. Surely this could not happen. In fact, Europe has a great many embers, far more than people ever pay attention to. And when you draw neat lines of secularization, and when you ask questions, absolutely legitimate questions to which people will give honest answers, you're missing a great many things in terms of those memories and those emotional connections which lie somewhat below the surface. And they are going to be, I will tell you right away, very different for Europeans than for Americans. So much of this will not apply in the United States. But let me look at some of the ways in which Christianity in Europe is not as dead as might be. Reports of its death have been greatly exaggerated. Number of points. First of all, Europe is a big place. I'm always suspicious of attempts to compare the United States to a European country, because what we should be doing is comparing the United States to the whole of Europe. That is true in terms of population, that is true in terms of size. If you fly from New York to Los Angeles, that's equivalent to flying from London to, guess where? Baghdad. It's a long way. You go out of Europe. There are many different communities within the United States, and in parts of New England, for example, they look very much like Europe in terms of their secularization. There is another Europe. There is still a very vibrant Christian Europe, mainly to the east of the continent, in countries like Poland, countries like Croatia, in Slovakia, in Romania, in Greece. When people talk about Islam being about to overwhelm Europe, I think of countries like Greece, for example. where the Greek government has been engaged in lively negotiations with the country's Muslims to let them erect a mosque. And these negotiations have been in progress since 1939, but they're moving along rapidly. Secularization moves in different ways. If you look at Poland, for example, in terms of any measure you care to look at, seminary populations, for example, belief in God, church attendance, Poland looks better than virtually any West European country ever did. This would be of marginal interest were it not for the fact that, at least prior to the European economic disasters last year, Poles were everywhere. Poles and Romanians and Croats and Slovaks spread throughout the continent, taking with them a very lively, basically Catholic Christian life. In Ireland, for example, certainly in the last census, there were more speakers of Polish than of Gaelic. There was said to be 1 million Poles in Great Britain. That's almost certainly untrue, because what happened was Slovaks and Romanians and other East Europeans were always told, when you arrive, tell them you're Polish. They like Poles, so we don't actually know, but it was a lot. So a lot of East European, South European religious styles came to Western Europe. I still have memories, for example, going to a town in Denmark. Denmark is one of these poster children for secularization. A town called Aarhus, just a small town. And you walk past the local, you see this throng in the street, and you ask your friend, what is that? Oh, that's the Catholic Church. But it's 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. Who are these people? And then you look at this little church where the masses, multiple masses every day, are provided in English, Polish, Vietnamese, Tamil, and Chaldean. And that's in a small church. Christianity did not look too dead in Aarhus. Danes weren't as much in evidence. But that does take me, so first of all, there's the other Europe. Secondly, residual Christianity. Christianity is a fever that takes a long time to sweat out of the system. And if you look, for example, at, again, Denmark, very, very secular country, church attendance rates of maybe about 3%. Basically, every child goes through confirmation. Now, you might say here that what you have here is something like the famous debate over how to get rid of bats in an old house. I mean, you must know this one. You have 3 people talking about how to get rid of bats in a house, and one man says, oh, I use this kind of poison, and another person says, oh, I use this kind of poison, and the third one is a pastor, and he says, what I do is I catch them, I baptize and confirm them, you'll never see them again. And to some extent, that's what happens with the Danes, but on the other hand, I have had the experience of trying to do business in Denmark, and I get this absolutely shocked response of, I can't talk to you on Tuesday. It's National Prayer Day. Støttebededag, National Prayer Day. Can you imagine if the United States tried to set up National Prayer Day? If it tried to introduce the Danish calendar of multiple days off for Easter, for Ascension, for all these holidays, whether if you pinned down a Dane and said, what is the meaning of the Ascension? What could they tell you about it? Maybe not. But the point I'm trying to make is that the institutions of religion, of Christianity, are absolutely founded in people's years, in the structure of the year, in the structure of the streets, in the structure of language. You know that you're out of pagan Germany and into Christian Bavaria when you start being greeted with Grüß Gott. That's the part of the world where people talk about, oh, tomorrow I am going to Germany. And never mind. I say nothing whatever about the content of any of this religion, but it remains there as a framework. But I do have a couple of interesting measures about content. Pilgrimage. When I mention pilgrimage, you may think of the Canterbury Tales. You may think of images that are distinctly medieval. And you might even think that in the 1950s you have something like Lourdes. Very nice. We live today, and I mean in the last 5 years or so, in the greatest ever age of Christian pilgrimage. More pilgrimage centers have been begun and established or revived in the last 20 or 30 years than in the last couple of hundred. Centers that in the 1950s might receive 50,000 visitors a year now receive several million. And I'm talking about famous places like Knock in Ireland, Lourdes in France, Compostela in Spain, but also many, many smaller shrines like Altötting in Bavaria, Maria Bistrica in Croatia, even shrines in the Netherlands are doing a roaring trade, and they should not be doing it. And the content of this religion is very interesting. It looks purely medieval. Anyone of Baptist background should turn off the next few remarks. These are shrines to the Virgin, and they are healing shrines. They are places where people will go, for example, to get a sacred collar put around their neck for throat problems. And as I say, some of them are very remarkable. The shrine, you had the famous Padre Pio in Puglia, in Italy, who supposedly received the stigmata, the marks of Christ. There is a brand new, within the last few years, pilgrim church there, which can accommodate 30,000 people. If a shrine or a church like this appeared in Africa, then people like me would probably write about it and say what an amazing expression of faith it is. Because it's in Italy, nobody sees it. Because it's not supposed to be there. We see things, all together now, we see things not as they are, we see things as we are. Alternatively, if I hadn't believed it, I wouldn't have seen it with my own eyes. And you may say, what is the content of this religion? You'd be absolutely justified in saying, are we talking religion here? Are we talking superstition? Are we talking tourism? And to which I would respond, all those questions could well be asked of Chaucer's pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales. Was that religion? Was it tourism? And the answer is, I don't know. Undoubtedly, the fact that people have got family cars is much more likely to mean that they can get to those places. And that's a legitimate comment. But the point I'm trying to make is that these ideas are in the background of people's minds. They are there. And it seems that they are ready to be stirred. Do you remember France, that country that is no longer Catholic? 2 years ago, they had a survey on the most admired French person of modern times. And the contest was an absolute shutout. I mean, there was no competition. And overwhelmingly, the best known, most admired French person was, who? Abbé Pierre, the founder of Emmaus, the religious movement for the homeless. So all these people are not Catholic. They're not going to admit they're Catholic. They're not going to admit they're Catholic when they go to shrines of the Virgin Mary. They're not going to admit they're Catholic when they say that Abbé Pierre best represents the ideas of France. And these are good secular people. We're dealing with an issue of memory. Wouldn't it be interesting if there was a revival movement that came along that could tap into some of these ideas? some of these interests in sanctity, in holiness, in the divine feminine, in Mary. And let me add one word. Sacred landscapes, sacred places, a very interesting idea that separates Europe from the United States. The United States, obviously, is a country of deep religiosity. It does not have the same kind of sacred landscapes. I mean, there are places. I mean, if you look at Latino Catholicism in the Southwest, for example, I can take you to places like Chimayo. And there are places like that, but they don't have the same central role. In Europe, you cannot throw a stone without hitting a place where prayer has been valid, a place with deep, specifically Christian roots. And you know, that old habit to long to go on pilgrimages is hard to sweat out of the system, and people keep on doing it. Wouldn't it be interesting if some group could, I don't want to say cash in on this, but develop this? Well, people do cash in on it, obviously, as in Chaucer's day. You know, if anyone ever tells you that franchising is a new idea, look at how they used to sell pilgrim sites in the Middle Ages. My favorite example, do you know the word? Well, I'll tell you the word. There was a great saint in England called Etheldreda, and whose name was vulgarized to Audrey, and people used to buy souvenirs of her, and they were so tacky. So what's the word they came up with? Tawdry. In other words, Tawdry takes its name from a bad saint franchise. And that gives you a pretty good idea. The Sacred Heart thermometer, you know what I'm talking about. All of which is to trivialize, in a way I do not mean to do, the movements that are at the heart of my story, the new Christian movements that have emerged and flourished in the last 30 or 40 years, and which have recognized the flaws of the mass church model and have attempted to replace it with something more fluid, more dynamic, and taking better account of the social, cultural, gender realities of contemporary Europe. You think, what would these movements possibly look like? These are movements which, as I say, many of them emerged in mid-century. And what I'm going to do is start by talking about the Catholic context. Europe is still the largest Catholic continent. Catholicism still represents a large part of the story. In the 1960s, Europe, that country in which religion was dying, had a very remarkable, charismatic revival. And it was chiefly concentrated in the Catholic churches and also in some of the other state churches, the Anglican churches, the Lutheran churches. If you think about it, state churches, mass churches, have a paradox built into them. It goes like this. On the one hand, they try and appeal to everyone. They are meant to be comprehensive. They're meant to serve the whole community, point one. On the other hand, they are also intended to preach the Christian message, which is a much more selective kind of standard. It is aiming to encourage holiness. It's not necessarily elitist, but the idea of serving everyone does not actually work. And there are clashes. Søren Kierkegaard lived within the Danish National Church, and of course, when he talked about boring, formal Christianity, that was the model he had in mind. And the big question then is, when a new movement does arise which teaches a new kind of holiness, a new kind of disciplined holiness, a new form of Christianity, can they be kept within the fold? The Wesleys could not, from the Church of England. The Baptists could not, from within the Church of England. The Roman Catholic Church, on the other hand, is very, very good at keeping these movements within the fold. If you ever want to read one of the greatest pieces of religious sociology, and written without a single equation, very, very readable, it's Lord Macaulay's review of von Ranke's History of the Popes, which you can get online, which tries to explain why the Catholic Church has done so well through the centuries, not just in surviving, but in flourishing and growing. And in a passage which is one of the most quoted passages in the history of religion, and it probably, the Roman Church was there when there was still a Roman Empire. It was there to meet Attila the Hun. It was there through the Middle Ages. And it'll probably be there when London is in ruins and some traveller from New Zealand sits on the ruins of London Bridge to sketch the ruins of St. Paul's Cathedral. So in other words, the Roman Church will still be there in Rome. Why? Because it is very good at arousing that reforming impulse and channeling it within its own structures. And if Macaulay was here today, he would say, and I quote, "Aha! That's what you're doing." What are some of these movements? First of all, groups like the Neo-Catechumenate originated in Spain in the 1960s. And you can recognize a word in that, which is catechumen. What is a catechumen? A catechumen is someone in the early church who is in the process of being a candidate, being instructed for baptism and full membership of the church. The basic idea is that modern Europe is a country, is a continent, a society, in which people must become catechumens again. They must relearn Christianity. And we cannot assume it anymore. So first of all, you cannot assume religious knowledge. Works very well. Secondly, it is mainly a lay movement which gets away from much of the opposition to priests, to clerical power. And it acts as, and they will use this term very freely, the Pauline term of leaven, yeast. A little yeast that makes the whole lump rise. And that little leaven, that neo-catechumenate, has become a very sizable piece of yeast. When the popes met the founders of the movement a few years ago, they were accompanied by 5 cardinals and a couple of thousand seminarians. Of course, the seminarians really matter, because they learn the neo-catechumenal way. They learn what you might call a small group Christianity, a Christianity that is very committed, does not just serve a large congregation, a mass church, but is aimed for a core group. And they take it to the parishes that they will serve. There are probably about a dozen of these new ecclesial movements. And from the 1980s, these were identified by Pope John Paul II as being the greatest hope for the salvation of Europe. His main ally in that was Ratzinger, of course, became Pope Benedict and has continued that. And very interestingly, they hold regular celebrations of these new movements every year on, what other day? Pentecost. Because they represent a new outpouring of the Holy Spirit in Europe. Popes are very historically minded creatures. They represent an institution that did face down Attila the Hun. They've been there a while. They have a lot of experience. And when they look at a crisis, when they look at a problem, they tend to look at these deep resources. Undoubtedly, what they have in mind is the experience of what Protestants call the Counter-Reformation, and what Catholics call the Catholic Reformation. It's an interesting use. Counter-Reformation means there's a real Reformation and you're against it. Catholic Reformation means, no, we had the real Reformation. But anyway. Why did Protestantism not conquer Europe in the 16th century? Because of, first of all, new devotional styles, a new emphasis, a new cultivation of sanctity, an extreme focus on the Virgin Mary as manifested in particular shrines, and also a series of new ecclesial orders, religious groups, highly disciplined, highly mystical, absolutely devoted to salvation from the, if you like, this elite out to the world, a little leaven. Best known example would be the Jesuits organized around the ferocious, the brilliant mysticism of the spiritual exercises. The new ecclesial movements have not produced anything of that quality as yet, but they are trying. Who do you have besides the Neo-Catechumenate? One group I find very interesting, all over Europe in the 1960s you had these charismatic movements. In France, that country which is no longer Catholic, many house churches organized to form something called the Emmanuel Community. The Emmanuel Community operates on a small group basis. It also organizes these regular, very large training schools, training camps, where they will bring in faithful believers, they will bring in seminarians, they'll bring in priests for retreats, and then sending them back reinvigorated to restore life in the parishes. I mentioned the idea of sacred space. They're based at a place called Paray-le-Monial in eastern France. And the geography is very interesting. Paray-le-Monial is where in the 17th century a nun had a vision of the Sacred Heart of Christ. It's a great Marian shrine. Down the road is Taizé, which is of course very well known to Protestants as well as Catholics. And down the road this way, very, very close, is Vézelay, one of the ancient centers of monasticism. It's hard in Europe to get away from a history of holiness, and it will be for a good long time to come. Apart from the Emmanuel community, you have a group like the Focolare in Italy. Focolare goes back to the 1940s. It was founded on the visions of a woman called Chiara Lubitsch. The Focolare are accused of being a cult. We can talk about that. But again, they operate on the basis of being the, and they use this very specifically, the yeast. They use these domestic images. They are the Focolare. The Focolare is the hearth. They bring people to their hearths and spread them out to their home parishes. In the 1970s, they began festivals for young people called Genfest. And then in the 1990s, these were taken over by the Roman Catholic Church, by the papacy, as World Youth Day. World Youth Day is a very interesting event. Happens every 3 years. And it calls forth media coverage, which you very rarely see in Europe. 2005 was a beauty. It was in Cologne, in Germany, a very secularized place. And the bishops looked at the people who were likely to come to World Youth Day to meet the Pope and said, please cancel. It's going to be embarrassing. You will have the Pope and you'll have a youth, one of them, you know. It's going to be awful. You don't want this. Several 100,000 youth turn up to rock star circumstances. And the German press is pouring out these things about, this disgusting, embarrassing enthusiasm. I say, isn't it nice once in a while to see European young people being dismissed as being vulgar fanatics for Christianity? Just once in a while. Interestingly, the most interesting thing that happened was, yes, John Paul II had this amazing image of being a world historical figure, and you could understand people turning out to observe him. But even when Benedict took over within the first few months, you got the same sort of audiences in the hundreds of thousands, in the millions, very, very young people. And as Grace Davy, one of the best scholars of European religion, remarked, it's incidents like that that show the paper-thin veneer that European secularism represents, which I find an interesting phrase. Interesting point about something like the Emmanuel community is the ideas that it combines, which would surprise certainly an American Protestant or evangelical audience. These are charismatic. These are, as I say, speaking in tongues, prophecy, vision. They are also profoundly Marian, and they are focused on pilgrimage. Pilgrimage, not in the sense of, through the pilgrimage of my life. I mean very specific pilgrimages to places where people have gone on pilgrimage for, the last 1,000 years or 1,500 years. I can give you many other examples of this. There's one phrase I like in Europe, where you have a great shrine called Walsingham in Eastern England. A man called Miles Dempsey had a vision telling him to form a new ecclesial movement there. It's called New Day. And he has a lovely phrase when he says what he wanted was all the aspects of the church together: charismatic, mystical, Marian, Eucharistic, liturgical. And he used a phrase, the church with all its lights on. And that's what the movements are aiming to do. You have groups like Italy's Sant'Egidio community, much smaller than some of the others, but which has been very, very powerful in organizing conferences, organizing ecumenical gatherings. You have Italy's Communion and Liberation. And you also have a group like the best known of them all, which is Opus Dei, which, of course, over the last few years has received the best publicity any religious group could ever have received from Dan. Well, the books are actually written by Mrs. Brown, but never mind. In the Dan Brown books. I know they were panicked at when those books came out, at what the response was going to be, but I think it was mainly, you really pull the strings of power around the world? Whoa! And I think they got a lot of interest from that. The new ecclesial movements represent an absolutely critical example of new religious movements in action. If you want to understand them, look at classic. We debate like the secularization thesis and these ideas. New religious movement theory. As the phrase goes, cults live on the unpaid bills of the churches. I'm not saying these groups are cults, but what I'm saying is that they are small, vibrant, new movements. They exist to meet the functions that the older churches could not meet. They're there to meet demand. In what way? They appeal enormously to women. Although the leadership of the groups will formally be male, women are massively represented and overrepresented in the organizational structure. The Italian charismatic movement is called Renewal in the Spirit, Rinnovamento nel Spirito. And that is a very kind of gender-balanced organization. It has a male head, and then below you start getting into women at every possible level. Many of the groups, by the way, are founded or co-founded by women, and that segues very easily into the Marian theory of the doctrine. I'll just say one thing quickly about the Anglican equivalent of this. If you look at the most secular countries in Europe, as I say, the most extreme would be Estonia and the Czech Republic. Great Britain and the Netherlands are also quite high on the list, which is why I find so much interest in the rise of what you can only call new ecclesial movements within the Church of England. Now, the Church of England was always basically had many divisions, you know, about high church, which is very liturgical, low church, very evangelical. Simple form, all together now. High and crazy, low and lazy, broad and hazy. Okay, those are the three divisions. In the 1960s also, the charismatic movement again, just at the time when secularization was running riot, started becoming very, very popular in Great Britain and within the Church of England. And a number of parishes within that church became virtually mega churches in their own right. Some of them are quite well known in the United States. Probably the best known is Holy Trinity, Brompton. There are some others like St. Andrews, Chorley Wood, St. Thomas in Sheffield, and a number of others. A number of points about these. First of all, these are very open to innovation from the global south. One thing I've not talked about, we can talk about this, is the sheer power of global south Christian migration in Europe, providing again a very strong new market for many of these churches. You know, four of the largest mega churches in Britain are pastored by Africans. On a typical Sunday in London, half the churchgoers are African or Afro-Caribbean. Once again, altogether now, the empire strikes back. If you look at these parishes, they're very charismatic in the sense that very few of their doctrines, in terms of the works of the Holy Spirit, of healing, of prophecy, would be out of place in an Assemblies of God church or a Pentecostal church in the United States. They also have devised very effective ways of spreading Christianity in a society where you can no longer count on stable employment, meeting people at school because they don't have kids, so they're not at school, where you can't rely on traditional assumptions of work and family, the best known of which is out of Holy Trinity came the Alpha Course. The Alpha Course is a classic example of networking, of working on a, if you like, an egalitarian basis, not in terms of people you meet in the job, because the people you meet in the job may only be there for a couple of months. The Alpha Course clearly has been one of the most effective European innovations in evangelizing a world which is unevangelizable, a word I propose to coin very quickly and copyright very quickly. The Roman Catholic Church, Roman Catholic authorities have said something interesting, which is the Alpha Course is the greatest gift of Protestantism to the Catholic Church since the charismatic movement. That's an interesting phrase. What I'm arguing here, I'm not suggesting that Christianity is about to revive in a huge way, that we're going to go back to the kind of mass Christian society, the mass church society of, say, the 1950s. But I would just make a couple of remarks. First of all, it is possible to exaggerate the solid Christian faith of Europe in years gone by. It might be the 1950s are not a particularly typical era. If you ever go to Paris and you want to see this in action, go to the cathedral where you can see the tombs of 3 successive archbishops of Paris, all of whom died violently. Executed by revolutionary mob, and just murdered for the hell of it. If that was an age of faith, okay, things are different. But let's assume that that the 1950s or 60s, for instance, did represent this kind of age of faith. First of all, church authorities, particularly in the Roman Catholic angle, are remarkably conscious of this. They realize they are not going back to the mass church. As Benedict has said, the mass church was a lovely thing, but it was not the only way of being church. And Benedict has been very interesting in developing a kind of two-stage view of Christianity, that there are the people who turn up for midnight mass and show up occasionally, and then there's the core of devoted believers. And he's the one who popularized the term creative minority, and there again is somebody with a great sense of the early church. Will the new movements succeed? Well, already, not surprisingly, when you have small, highly committed groups, they're very open to scandal. One at least has already flamed out, which the Legionaries of Christ, their founder, the revelations about him and his misdeeds accumulate on a steady basis, and that would be a hard one to support. But, you know, if I was predicting, I would say that the new movements have one great force on their side, and that is the power of Islam. I often quote a German Lutheran bishop who said, God sent the Muslims to Europe to bang our Christian heads together. And by that, let me emphasize, he did not mean that in a hostile, confrontational way. He did not mean in the sense of, now we must unite against these dreadful Muslims. What he meant was, we've always assumed that this was a Christian continent. Nothing could challenge that. But suddenly we realized there are other ways. After the cartoon controversy in Denmark a few years ago, people were heard muttering, soon we won't be able to go to church anymore, as if that had ever bothered them in the past. As the phrase goes, you don't know what you've got until it's almost gone. And it's been so interesting in the last few years to see, even from within some of the very liberal churches, remarkable statements of not hostility to Islam, I emphasize that again, but concern about looking for the Christian roots of European societies. As you know, the famous line about the Church of England, the consecration of a bishop is a wonderful thing, right up to the official movement where they remove his backbone. Anglican bishops are famous for bending to the winds, shall we say. But in the last few years, particularly since some of the terrorist attacks, since the cartoon incident, for example, there has been more of an assertiveness, a looking for the roots of Christian society in Europe. And those statements are all the more credible, certainly for the media, because they come from people like one of my favorite clerics in Europe, the Archbishop of York. The Archbishop of York, a see founded in 627, is a Ugandan called John Sentamu. And because he is a Ugandan, perhaps, he can get away with saying things about the Christian roots of England and why missionaries are a fine thing, which no one else could. He also has a very good sense of humor, which is when he visited the Pope a couple of years ago, he had to take a gift. What present do you take to a German Pope? Well, obviously beer. And in his diocese, they brew something called Holy Grail beer, and so he did, whatever. But interestingly, I would suggest that you have two factors here. You have these new movements recreating a kind of grassroots Christianity. But at the same time, you have at least some Christians who are looking for a renewed Christian public voice. And the people who are calling out for this are, among others, Muslim leaders. One of the, I have one lovely interview that I quote in my God's Continent book, where I quote the leader of the Muslim Council of Britain, who's a relatively conservative, not exactly fundamentalist guy, but a very conservative guy, who is denouncing the Archbishop of Canterbury because he is afraid to take stands on moral issues, for instance, about drink and gambling. As the prophet said, this could be the start of a beautiful friendship. So what I'm suggesting is that Christianity in Europe is doing something even more interesting than dying. It is morphing to accommodate a change to cultural and economic postmodernity. And it's performing a really significant experiment, and as the phrase goes, if it can survive there, it can survive anywhere. And my final remark, no. I did not write a short book. Religion in Europe is worth a very long book, and it's going to be worth a very long book, because it may be the scene of secularization, but it's also the scene of some of the most interesting religious experiments in the world right now. Thank you.
I'll just say a word and then let you feel whatever you say. I'll just say a word and then please. Stay here, please.
Sure.
We're most grateful, as we've already indicated by our applause. We now have opportunity for people to ask questions. Would you please come forward to the two microphones that have been set up in the aisles? Why don't people come forward ready to speak, ready to put the questions, and our speaker will field those questions. Where's the first, please? Thank you.
Began by saying, it's demographics you give us kind of the setup. Can you talk a bit about priesthood in the Catholic Church and what's going to happen with the democratic problem and priesthood, where that's going, where the creativity solution is going to come to that problem?
Yeah. In terms of basically vocations and the collapse of vocation. Well, that, as I say, has been one of the largest problems, the collapse in vocations. I don't think that's because of the abuse crisis, which has hit several countries. I think the abuse crisis is part of the problem. In other words, that the fact that people are prepared to speak out about this reflects an underlying crisis of faith in the church. What people have tried to do is very interesting, is to use almost a colonial solution, whereby if you go to France these days, if you go to a French seminary, the priests you see will be African, they will be Vietnamese. I had a friend who foolishly thought he could go to Mass in rural France on a Sunday. And it was in an area where there were 17 historic parishes which had been merged under one priest who was Vietnamese, and the French complained about his accent. I would suggest that it will be a long time before vocations to the priesthood return. Vocations to the convent, vocations to monastic order, I can see recovering, and they actually are in Italy right now. There's been a remarkable upsurge in women trying to entering convents. But that's one of the biggest areas of crisis. The only way that problem can be solved is by moving away from traditional senses of clerical leadership to much more emphasis on the laity. And that's why, again, the new ecclesial orders are so important, because groups like the Neo-Catechumenate are always being criticized for putting too much emphasis on lay power as opposed to clerical. So, clearly that's going to be one of the biggest long-term issues. But in the short term, the new world is coming to the aid of the old. As our questioner risks life and limb to get to the microphone.
I want to maybe say something about architecture. One of the challenges, it seems to me, for the churches in Europe is that often they're seen going cap in hand to the people, saying, please give us thousands for our new roof. But it seems to me that from your analysis, these buildings are increasingly going to be a resource, not a liability for the church. And I'm wondering whether you can comment on that.
They certainly have been a major liability, and above all in England, for example, where you have all these these wonderful treasures, and what do you actually do with them? And it's like a self-defeating thing. If you take over a church and restructure it for a modern worship space, you remove much of the appeal of it for people who want to, if you like, tap into those historic roots. And so the problem of balancing something which is new and spirit-filled and charismatic, but also appeals to people who might be turning up for, who might be going on pilgrimages, who might be interested in the history, you really cannot reconcile the two. This, by the way, is one of the biggest differences with the United States. When a church goes out of use in the United States, it becomes what? A church. It becomes a Korean church or a Mexican church, whatever. Churches in Europe really do tend to go out of use. The best solutions, the best scenarios I've seen there are where churches go over to immigrant congregations. There's a rather ambitious pastor, a Nigerian pastor, who actually runs the biggest megachurch in London, and Matthew Ashimolowo, and he made a wonderful suggestion a few years ago, a very practical suggestion to the Church of England. He pointed out that they had buildings but no believers, he had believers but no buildings, so could he please have their churches? As yet, no answer has been received. But no, that's a critical problem, and it does turn the church into an architectural preservation society. And that's not a good thing to be. If you ever go to the Netherlands, for example, if you go to Amsterdam, you can see all these wonderfully preserved churches, which are museums. And you could just put up a sign out here saying, Museum of the Late Lamented Religion of Christianity. And that would be a perfect picture. How would I feel if they took out some of the monuments and made it into something more like a charismatic worship space? I'd probably swallow very hard, but I could understand why they were doing it.
One comment and one question. Recently, I took a group of students to Northampton, birthplace of Benedict. We were a group of young people there who really returned, we revitalized the Benedictine Seeking of the Hours.
Yep.
But they were all Americans from the Midwest.
Interesting.
A number of them were converts, evangelical Catholic converts.
Wow.
So maybe Chris Figuerville.
Yeah.
But I guess my question is, what about the EU? How does this figure in discussions? I know that it was Peter Berger who was recanted of secularization, except for Europe, a number of years ago, speculated that the success, if the EU is successful, then it creates a greater political community and greater affluence that is only going to strengthen some forces of secularization. But
Yeah.
can you address that or just
Sure.
the EU can resolve the way?
You know, one thing which surprises me that maybe American media don't pay more attention to, Europe right now is going through an experiment which should be fascinating for Americans, which is they are basically doing now what the new American Republic did in the first 40 or 50 years of its existence in terms of creating federal authority, federal law, and basically a federal Supreme Court. And many of its issues, many of its decisions are going to concern issues of freedom of religion, issues of discrimination concerning homosexuality, concerning gender, concerning free speech and hate speech. And you know, as one looks at this now, the chances for fairly conservative Christians do not look good. It looks like being a fairly, repressive kind of structure in that way. One other part of that is that many of the legal provisions which emerge for Muslims will also end up penalizing Christians. So I would see that as one major fact, which is the legal angle. The most important positive feature for religion, for Christianity, is freedom of movement. It means, for example, that people from more conservative, religiously, more traditional-minded parts of the continent can move freely. Like I said, 1 million Poles or would-be Poles landed in England just in the space of about 5 to 10 years. In a couple of years, that will mean a lot of actually fairly old-style Muslims with very little time for extremism are going to be moving from the Balkans into Western Europe. So that mobility is a big issue. The chance that the EU is going to increase prosperity, I am not holding my breath. I will say this kind of very, very roughly, and we can talk about it. It's much more likely to preserve a system where you do have a fairly permanent underclass. And among that underclass, you are going to get a lot of churches and mosques serving their needs. I think America is going to be a much more resilient society in that way, but we can talk about that. But no, you're absolutely right. The most important thing, labor mobility. Mobility of people, mobility of ideas, and a great benefit for any organization which is not wedded to an old structure of parishes and dioceses, which can just set up very, very freely, whether it is a Muslim group or a Christian group. The Focolare, they operated behind the Iron Curtain all through the Cold War. What they're now saying is, we survived communism, we'll survive European secularism. We operate on these cells, these groups. We do great underground. The mass church doesn't. We do. So, a couple of quick comments, please. Yep.
I'm looking at pilgrimage in Russia and Catholic statistics are rather hard to come by.
Yeah.
Some of the ones that seem to be growing fastest are extremely arduous. For instance, walking 150 kilometres over 5 days, getting up to 170 hours. That's
Yep.
Lockdale or Patrick growing faster now, for instance.
Yeah. Yes, some of the ones in Ireland, for example, where you have to, climb the hill on your knees, and yes, there are a lot of those, and they run the whole gamut from places where you drive, you check things out, and don't do much, to things like that. I'm glad you said that about Russia. Russia, of course, is seeing a huge revival of pilgrimage, but I would also be very nervous about the numbers. But again, to places with an amazing history, like Optima Poussin and Valam and all these great churches, which go back to the world of Dostoevsky and the riches of Russian culture. But yeah, you see the whole the whole gamut. But come back to this. I'm interested in the kind of the memory substructures that revivals can base themselves on, and in the Anglo-American model, really place is not so important. There are some examples where maybe, but in traditionally Catholic Europe, they are so critical in Orthodox Europe. I must just mention one thing, by the way, which is one of my favorite pilgrimage stories. There's a place in Lithuania called Kryžių Kalnas, which is the Hill of Crosses. And it emerges in the 19th century when the Lithuanians are very oppressed by the Russians. There's a hill where people put crosses, and it becomes a pilgrimage shrine, okay? Then you get the oppression by the Soviets and the Nazis, and as the oppression gets worse, the crosses grow. Then the Soviets move in at one point, take all the crosses down, then the following night they've gone from 3,000 to 20,000, and they grow, and they grow, and they grow. Then the Pope goes there and consecrates the place. And what you've got is basically a new, vast East European pilgrim shrine, which also comes to be associated with national identity. What do you mean you don't believe in Kryžių Kalnas? You're not Lithuanian? And it's very hard to uproot a religion like that or a shrine like Rila in Bulgaria. So it takes a long time to get out of the system. Anyone else? Hey.
In Lost History, you talk about Christianity extinguished, sort of one by one, lights.
Yeah, the lights go out.
Very nice imagery. Well, I guess nice, nicely described imagery of Christianity, these lights going out. But I hear today you say basically these lights in Western Europe are still shining. And perhaps, I hear from the lecture, perhaps on the threshold of lighting up the place again. So I'm curious as to why the difference in interpretation.
Sure.
Lights going out as opposed to Western Europe. Perhaps instead of the lights going out, you see them as sort of illuminating.
Yeah. Word of explanation, I wrote a book called Lost History of Christianity, which is about how basically the Christian Middle East became the Muslim Middle East. And as you said, I was talking about how some of these churches are gradually, snuffed out, and then they're reduced to these tiny, tiny populations. And I make a point of drawing a difference. Some people talk about the death of Christianity in Western Europe. What I emphasize is that religions generally don't die. They have to be killed. And in order to kill a religion, it really takes some work and some persecution and a long time. I mean, in the case of some of the Muslim regimes are very tolerant. In the case of some of the Muslim regimes, it takes centuries. Well, clearly, even the Soviets only had 70-odd years. So I'm seeing it as a very different thing. I don't want to buy into a lot of the rhetoric that some people have about the death of Christianity. Religions don't die. They don't fade away. They have to be wrestled to the ground and killed. And there is not a government or a regime in likely sight in Europe that has any goal of doing such a thing. So I do emphasize that difference. It just reminds me of one of my favorite passages. Alcuin, great Anglo-Saxon scholar, was writing about the year 800, and he said, 100 years ago, Europe was completely dark, but now, he said, the whole of Europe is speckled with churches as the night sky with stars. I always like that image. Well, Europe today is not speckled as the night sky with stars, but there are some stars, and some of them are quite stellar.
You mentioned something about the influence of the global South.
Yes.
And I know that in the United States, there's been, over the last few years, a lot of talk about what's going to happen to America relative to the year 2050. They call it browning America.
Sure.
So what can you offer, or can you give some commentary on if the influence of the global South coming into Europe on this, especially given the fact that the EU is going on this path of federalism? Because, again, in this country, they say that if in fact this browning America occurs by the year 2050, that's going to have an impact on politics, economic policy, what groups end up getting political power, economic power, etc.
Yeah, sure. We know by 2050, great phrase to have up on your wall, the United States will be becoming a majority-minority society. 25% of its people will have Latino origins, 8% Asian origins, about 15 or 16% African-American origins. That's going to be a huge change. Very interesting thing about Europe. You hear about Europe being taken over and being swamped by Islam and the global South. By American standards, the numbers in Europe are really small. Look, if you go to a city in this country and you say, what's it like population-wise? And someone says, oh, it's about 4.5% minority. You say, oh, it's all white, eh? Where are we, Minnesota? Well, in Europe presently, the Muslim share of the population is 4.5%. No, hang on. Hello. The Muslim share of the population is reported to be 4.5%. Actually, that's not exactly true either. That 4.5% represents people who are either Muslim or who come from Muslim countries and are presumed to be Muslim or have Muslim names. We have no way of knowing what their actual religious affiliations are. There are a lot of Christian migrants from the global south in Europe, and some of them are almost invisible. I mean, like one thing I find interesting: the standard Italian word for a domestic servant is a Filipina. I want a Filipina. There are huge numbers of Filipinos who tend to be very faithful. They're great supporters of their churches. There are African churches, African denominations all over Germany. If you want to see the mega churches in France and in Belgium, they tend to be run by Congolese. In Britain, well, of course, they're Nigerians. So, you know, you have all these different groups. Undoubtedly, Europe will be browner, but it will still, even by the end of this century, be a far whiter society than the United States. They'll just be much more worried about it. And you know, obviously, that will have a lot of implications in terms of attitudes to the Middle East. If you do have a population which is a much more Muslim or Arab world-oriented population, that is going to be a big issue. Harry Truman, back in 1948 in this country, said, "I never heard of an election being decided by the Arab vote." Well, come to Europe, and you will.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've enjoyed a very rich afternoon's exposition. I would single out three particular features. The range of what we've heard, range both over time and space. I have very few acquaintances who can talk with that degree of confidence of Estonia in a stray giveaway phrase. Secondly, and the Alcuin quotation draws our attention to this feature of the presentation, it was star-studded. Did you like, as I thoroughly enjoyed, that introduction of the derivation of the word tawdry, again in a throwaway phrase? Isn't that magnificent? And thirdly, and perhaps even more substantially, the future predictions. We're told that a creative minority will continue to be there in Europe, not just now, but over the longer-term future. We have had a wealth of reasoned judgments about the future, and it's rare to hear a paper that offers those so convincingly. For those three reasons in particular, but also for all you've said, we're extremely grateful. Thank you very much.